Welcome to the Business of Engineering, the official podcast from Element 14, the world's largest online community for makers, engineers and tech professionals. In this series, we're going to be talking to entrepreneurs and business leaders about some of the challenges and opportunities involved in working with the tech sector. I'm John Lucas, and I'm happy to be joined today by Taras Lanchev, founder and director of Meet with Focus, Keith McCabe, CEO at Simplifai Systems, and Daniel Burkhardt Cerigo, a freelance data scientist specialising in AI systems. Our topic today is the impact of AI and smart technology on startup marketing. In 2018, there were over 79 million devices with embedded AI. This is expected to rise to 1.2 billion in 2023. Embedded and connected devices are now taking centre stage across the tech sector, providing new opportunities for innovation, data analysis, automation, and more. First of all, I'd like to give you guys an opportunity to introduce yourselves and your businesses.
So I'm Keith McCabe. I'm the CEO of Simplifai Systems. Simplifai Systems is a company that applies artificial intelligence to traffic control in smart cities to try and configure and reconfigure the way cities work to make it easier to move around and also improve air quality.
My name is Taras. I am a founder and director of Meet with Focus. What we do is we make a meeting scheduling application for businesses, which allows them to schedule meetings with their partners and teams around the world.
I'm Daniel Burkhardt Cerigo. I'm a freelance data scientist and I do consultancy and hands-on data science development for businesses. Generally, that's building large-scale optimization and automated decision-making systems using predictive modeling, reinforcement learning, and trying to improve those businesses' top and bottom line performance.
Great, okay. As I mentioned, we're talking about AI today. Now, AI, artificial intelligence, it's one of those phrases that's been around the industry for decades now. People always seem to be saying it's going to be the next big thing, but it really does feel like now it's reaching some kind of tipping point for accessibility. Would you agree? Do you think we're in kind of a new era for AI at the moment?
Well, I think in the past the thing that's held it back is that people weren't leaving big enough data trails. Whereas you look at the kind of modern world that we're in, almost every form of human activity leaves data trails, and where AI is coming into its own is through the analytics of those data trails to try and make sense of the modern world, to try and make more of the sort of nuances of complexity, either in a business sense for a bit of economic advantage, or in a, like the sense we're in, to maybe organise and reorganise the way we move around.
I would add to that, saying that completely agree with your point, and I feel like the big part of it that made it possible is the accessibility of APIs on services. So, for example, our business relies a lot on APIs from different calendar services like Google, Microsoft, etc. And by having access to that data, we can analyze it and feed it to the model that we have. Similarly,
I'd probably just go an even step further and say, the internet, if you want to study a system and use machine learning and AI, you need to be measuring it. And the internet was really the first big, valuable, important system that already comes pre-measured. It's already semi-structured data and it's already connected to computers, so it's just ripe for analyzing with computers. So I appreciate computational power as a part of it, but with the birth of the internet, then really you have this clear first use case of how to apply it, and that's where these methods are coming from. And clearly it's growing as more and more devices get connected and more measurements are in effect being made of the world around us.
Mm-hmm. And what about AI in 2019 excites you the most in terms of where it's going or what it's got the potential to do and things that are opening up right now?
I think the fascinating thing in the sphere that I'm in is the application of machine learning and visual analytics to understanding the real world to allow vehicles to travel through it without human intervention. That potentially changes a lot in terms of the way we travel around and makes the kind of movement and interaction between machines and vehicles in urban areas and interurban space very different from what it did previously.
Mm-hmm. What you see?
Accessibility. Right now I feel like there is a lot of accessibility to AI that wasn't there before. The platforms on the internet making it possible for people to come around and just give it a go and play around with it. And this is what we do a lot. If we have an idea, we would just plug it into the service and see what it does, see what the output is.
I think for me, the one that I'm most excited for and really would love to do some more work in is in healthcare and generally human health overall. It's just, modern medicine is great, but there's still so much further we can go. And I think it's going to be by leveraging these huge data sets and by leveraging all the information we're collecting about humans and their health, we're going to make these steps to really understand the human body in a much, much granular, more fine detailed way. Really excited to see what's going to come out in that space.
And how do you think AI is going to play into that specifically?
Well, in terms of just, you need these advanced methodologies to study systems at that scale. So, if you're a physicist, you might study some planets orbiting each other, but it's quite simple. You can write down, you can make some measurements and you can write down a little model. But the thing that these machine learning algorithms do is to model things at a complexity that we could never do ourselves. So if you want to study a whole human and say a very fine granular level, you're not going to be writing down that model yourself. You're going to be building a model and optimizing it using machine learning algorithms. And that's what AI, in effect, I guess you could say it is.
What do you think some of the most common misconceptions about AI are to the general public?
I have to say for mine, I'm often apprehensive about actually using the term artificial intelligence. I think my studies was in physics and philosophy, and I think artificial intelligence was, it's been around for a long time now, like tens of years, and originally it had a big philosophical slant to it. They're talking about, it's about what's possible with computer science and what intelligence even is and what it would be for a computer to be intelligent. So I'm often quite careful about using it. I would probably go for machine learning or data science, and that's really the area that I'm in. But and I think that kind of adds to that mysticism that we're using artificial intelligence a lot in these cases where we could just be doing advanced statistics, for example.
So people are still hear the term and think of like a walking robot with feelings, data from Star Trek or something. So, yeah.
That's it, yeah. Whereas you might just be doing linear regression, right?
Yeah. What about you two?
So I work in a slightly different field of AI from what most people do. We work in a field called AI planners, which is where the knowledge or the intelligence gets embedded into the software. So it isn't a machine learning technique, it's the use of embedded intelligence to solve a problem. Now the interesting thing about that, and the tension between that and machine learning, is that a lot of the quite difficult problems need an element of data and the analytics of large data sets, but you do need what you might call a domain expert, somebody who can make intelligent the results and understand whether they're the right thing or not. So if you're doing something related to the physical world, physicists are quite useful to give it a reality check to understand it. And it's not something that replaces human intelligence, it just helps us do more. And you've got to pick the right techniques and use them in the right way. So the big misconception is that it can solve everything easily, but actually with the help of really good experts and a lot of human interaction, we can do a lot more.
And a lot of these most complicated systems, they have some element of machine learning, but they also have, hand-built rules into them, right? So say in autonomous driving, you're obviously going to have some rules and checks that you're going to write in there and say, make sure you're stopping in these scenarios. And exactly that combination of the domain expertise and hand grooming what the model's going to do or what the system's going to do, plus these large-scale data-driven stuff.
Yeah, how they had when AI essentially beat a human in chess, it didn't become essentially something that is completely ununderstandable for us. It became a helper to the human. It became something that we rely on, but we still play chess outside of it. So,
yeah.
Keith, how long have you run a business obviously related to AI now, how long have you been in the AI business? Have you been working with it?
I suppose I got a few grey hairs, and I've actually been in the transport technology business for over 35 years now. And I've only started into the AI business when the AI business started to become useful. Because when we were looking at stuff maybe, what would be now nearly 20 years ago to upgrade, say, motorway technology in the UK, the AI wasn't quick enough and there wasn't enough data. So now AI can do things quickly enough to be operationally expedient, and there's a lot more data. So it's a bit like what a lot of good engineers do is you use the best techniques that are available to you at any time. And it just so happens over the last 10 years, AI has become more and more useful, so you start to use it more and you start to kind of get a better understanding of it. But also bring in the experts. We work closely with the University of Huddersfield Computer Science Department, who are, in the field that we use, the leading experts in Europe. So you've got to have the expertise in the AI to work with as well.
Well, that brings me on to another question I was going to touch on, which is, how did your interest in AI kind of come about? And because it develops so quickly, what resources do you use to stay in touch with the way it is evolving and the new trends that are coming through in the technology?
Yeah, certainly. Trying to keep up is a really difficult one. I think for anybody who's wanting to become a real practitioner or stay up to date, if you check out Kaggle, which is an online data science competition platform, you'll often see pick a competition that's similar to your problem you're trying to solve, and you can go check out what were the winning solutions and what were some great, really effective and simple ones. And often you're seeing really cutting, even bleeding edge stuff being used in these competitions, especially because there's often lots of money riding on the line. So you really see some incredibly sophisticated models being implemented there, and they're often shared and explained. So
for us, I guess it's a more casual way, but there are a lot of YouTube channels available on the internet where you can literally go and see people messing around with it, seeing what they're doing. And I feel because of that kind of creativity, you can re-engineer the solutions that they already have and see how it could be applicable to you. And even though it's quite a casual way, I feel because of the accessibility of AI that came through in the past 5-7 years, it's quite important to see what the community is doing and see what the people who are involved in that field are doing.
I don't think there's any substitute for talking directly to the people who are at the cutting edge of things, because normally they're actually quite humble folk and are prepared to share with things. I know I sit on the US Transport Research Board's Artificial Intelligence Committee, which is nicely populated with lots of professors who are leaders in their field for artificial intelligence. But if you went into the room, you wouldn't necessarily know that, because they will really get interested in sharing the understanding and the solving of really complex problems, and to try and bring, especially people who are not quite so old and grey, bringing people into that to actually take that up as a profession, is the thing that actually people who are leaders in the field want to do the most, to actually bring on new generations into a new field of learning.
Mm-hmm. It has been said that there's something of a talent shortage in the AI field, just because at the moment it's growing at such an exponential rate and so many businesses are now wanting to get on with connected devices and smart technology. Have you found that it's been difficult to find qualified people to work with, or what routes do you take to make sure you're working with the right people?
It is always difficult to find good talent, and I think I've solved it partially by working with one of the best universities in the UK. But it's not just a problem for artificial intelligence. I know when I was the chair of the Institute of Engineering and Technology in Manchester, we looked at some of the skill shortages in engineering in the Northwest, and it's that there's a real need to bring young people in to solve problems that are difficult. Engineering's difficult, AI's difficult, but actually the rewards you get for studying and understanding and solving more complex problems are the sort of things that then create a new world. So it is difficult to get talented people, and I think in the UK, as we're sitting in Leeds, should be well aware that a lot of the AI talent gets sucked down to London or sucked over to the west coast of America, or actually is now emerging from China, all the best talent. So it's more of a problem trying to get them to come to places like this, places in the north of England, to grow businesses here. So we might be doubly challenged, but actually it's really exciting time to try and do it.
And Daniel, as a freelancer, you're on the other side of that, I guess. Have you found that it's easier to get work up here, not living in like the West Coast or in London, or have you ever been tempted to move, or have you lived in those places?
I'll go back a step and say, I think probably, judging by my LinkedIn inbox and the number of recruiters or just companies reaching out about trying to have data science work done, I'd say there's certainly right now a definitely higher demand than there is supply. And yeah, exactly. I've originally was based in London for the past few years. I've kind of worked all over in other countries even for the past kind of 5 years. And yeah, most of it is in London, but I'm really trying to build connections up north, and that's great doing that here. My advice, I think, to organizations trying to deal with that that kind of deficit is, one, there's quite a few companies out there that will come in and upskill your staff. And actually, if you're a medium-sized business, you don't need bleeding edge experts. You don't need super cutting edge stuff. You might just need some quite simple, effective solutions. And actually, they could come in and begin the upskilling of your staff. They can self-learn, and they can start trying to implement this stuff themselves, and that can often make big gains, like think big, actual monetary gains for your organization. And the other one is that, in the same way, say web development, before organizations had to have a website, suddenly every business needs to be online. And I can imagine there was a whole skill shortage for front-end developers, whereas now you don't need a front-end developer to build a website. There's services that already do that for you, and that's already happening in the data science world. And this is this idea of kind of data science as a service, or kind of pay-as-you-go algorithms. So all the cloud providers are clearly invested heavily into this. So Amazon, Google, they all have AI sections on their cloud platforms where you can basically use algorithms off the shelf. So you don't need a data scientist. You can just, you certainly have to collect your data yourself, and then you go fire it up into their platform in the right structure, and it will just churn out predictions for you. And this is a really good way of getting to harness the power of data science without needing what is, very big overheads in terms of time, risk, and money in terms of developing your own internal data science team. So certainly, either upskilling the team you have or trying to use these off-the-shelf solutions could be a really good way of solving that.
It's quite funny coming back to the kind of the tech scene in Yorkshire. I was at the panel last Thursday organised by Yorkshire Post, and the article came out today about the skill shortage of tech people in Yorkshire and in Leeds in particular. And we see that not just with artificial intelligence, but also with normal coders, with programmers. All of them go down to London. But it's there is an interesting part in there, because a lot of people go to London straight after university, but then they come back after a few years because London is busy, London is huge, you don't really get a life there, and a lot of people actually head north. And what we found from our experience is it's worth approaching people in London and saying there are opportunities in Leeds and there are opportunities in Yorkshire, and you can come here and stay here. Our team is actually pretty dispersed, so we have people in Manchester, we have people in Eastern Europe, and I'm the only one in Leeds, and we all work together because of Slack, and it's totally possible to work online, so it doesn't have to be like that.
And again, being open to working with remote workers suddenly increases your pool you have accessible to, orders of magnitude, right? If you need somebody in Leeds, that's really restricting yourself. Whereas if you're happy to work with someone remotely, which is becoming just such more and more common these days, that really gives you so much more opportunity out there in terms of finding somebody.
Yeah, if you say that I only need talent in Leeds, you're just limiting yourself to the talent in Leeds.
And you might need that, but if you can work with someone remotely, then you're giving yourself such a bigger pool to choose from and find from. So definitely.
Yeah.
Keith, you said that around 10 years ago, I think you said, was when the kind of the tipping point came for your company, where AI started to become more possible and more feasible for what you were doing. What's in that time since between then and now? What's the biggest change to AI since you first started implementing it into your systems, and where you're at with it today?
Well, maybe describe three things. One is I think it's commonly called connected devices. If you go back 15 years, a vehicle, a car or motorbike or a truck or something, hardly any of them were connected to anything in real time. They were all separate devices, and you had very little information on them. In fact, the way in the transport industry we used to detect them was a little inductive loop in the road, and you'd detect a bit of metal going past. And because cars were bigger than bikes, you'd detect cars easier than bikes, which, it was functional. But actually, it's much better to know what it is, where it's going, where it's come from, and then make much more sophisticated decision making. And I think if you look at the vehicle industry over the last decade, as it's moved towards more and more connected and now more and more autonomous and connected, that means that every new vehicle that comes off the production line has the ability to talk to any other new vehicle and any control centre. So that's been a huge tipping point. The other thing that's really important about cities is we know more about the way people move around now. And large organisations, certainly large retail organisations like Google and Amazon and others, know more about why people move around because they know what they're doing as they're moving in terms of buying stuff or interacting with places. So that kind of richness means travel isn't just what do we do with this bit of metal as it goes past this point. It's now actually people who plan cities can think about how do you manage your city, what are we trying to achieve here, and how do we best interact with the people within a city. So that's, in some respects, it's made the problem more difficult, but actually solving it makes people's lives so much better. So that's the real tipping point, the fact that you can detect more when the data trails are much richer.
I'd like to go back a little bit to a point you raised about there. You mentioned connected devices, and I think that has been one of the biggest, certainly in the past 5-10 years, one of the big buzzwords around artificial intelligence is this rise of smart devices, connected devices, and voice activation. What are your guys' perspective on that, how those are being used and how they've come up? Bit of a broad question, I know.
No, I mean, I'm in a way all for it. I think if you want to make big progress and big understandings and, solve really big, difficult problems, you need to be taking more measurements, getting more information about these systems. But all this kind of stuff really, and it is happening, but you really have to do all the ethical investigation and, deliberation behind this stuff. So as an example, just recently they passed some regulation in France basically saying that it's to do with judiciary data, so information on basically the legal system. And it's regulation that says you can't study it. You literally are not allowed to analyse information pertaining to legal proceedings in France any longer. And it's not simply just you can't, say if you're a solicitor, you might have a client come and they might present their case and you might be deciding whether to take it on or not. And you might want to predict how likely it is you're going to win that case. It's not the regulation says you can't do that. It's saying you literally can't even download the data and just having a bit of an investigation on your computer. So, and that's kind of like one way that governments are dealing with the ethics behind this stuff and regulating it. I'm not sure whether just outright banning it entirely is the thing to do, but once you get this once you get this scale of information and you can get this scale of prediction for the future, it comes with a really huge host, especially in cases, say, legal or health-wise or movement-wise. It's a real minefield, and it's going to be interesting to see how, as we get all this information, what we're going to do with it.
It's quite interesting you mentioned that, but we've also seen a huge pushback in terms of privacy of people, especially with the Cambridge Analytica scandal and Facebook.
Of course,
yeah. And I feel like there is a lot of people saying, yes, who cares that our data is being used? There are obviously people pushing against it, but on an individual scale, people don't really see the value in their own data, but when it comes to the aggregate scale, then that's where the value is. Yeah. And a lot of people don't understand how it works. They don't understand where the data is going, how it's being analyzed, what are the outcomes of it. And I feel like the companies are not making a good enough progress, and they're not being transparent enough about how the data is being used and what the outcomes of that data is after you process it.
Yeah, I'd imagine most people would shudder if they really saw the kind of really detailed stuff that could be predicted about them based on their online profiles, and not only the profiles but their online behaviour and stuff. It's really can be quite scary.
Well, we've all seen Black Mirror, so.
Yeah. Well, I hope you've all seen Black Mirror. Yeah. If not, definitely go watch it. Yeah.
Have you run into any issues like that, Keith, in terms of security and ethics around the data that you're processing on a daily basis?
Yeah, I suppose we run into them a lot, and I suppose I'll describe myself as one of those people who always focusing on, so what's the error rate of what you're predicting, and why is it making an error, and what's the implications of that. And as the technology gets better, the error rates get smaller, but you can imagine when, say, video analytics, when it first started, it was 50% of the time it could detect a person. Couldn't really tell who it was, but at 50%. Now you can 90% chance of detecting a particular person, or even 95%. However, when you then take it into a legal context, so 1 in 20 is the wrong person. That's not really good enough in front of the law. And it's those sorts of issues where you've got the balance between the law, which requires transparency, openness, clarity, and everyone being treated fairly and equally, and technology which isn't perfect. Technology that is analysing, I think as one of the early points I made, the data trails we leave behind us. The data trails we leave behind us aren't us. They're the data trails we leave behind us. And if everything about you is concluded from those data trails, you're not being fairly judged as the way you are, because some people, not everyone leaves massive trails and not everyone doesn't. So it's that sense that the ethical questions around it and the legal questions around the use of artificial intelligence need to be had in the open, and they need to be had broadly across society, not just amongst the expertise who work on this every day. Because, as technology, it can do some really useful things. I was at a fascinating summit last week, which was an AI summit between the UK and China, hosted by the IET in London. And one of the speakers was talking about the transformation of credit in Kenya, and how credit transactions were transformed from being cash into cashless almost overnight, and the take-up rate. But he'd done it on the basis of how they could work out what was a good and a bad loan using machine learning. And they just went with the data and worked out, what's the best thing to loan people and how do you reduce the default rate. Now, it had some really interesting insights, but I'm imagining for the people who were refused loans who previously would have got them, it then causes a bit of a social problem. So you have to get an all-rounded sense of what this technology creates in terms of benefits, but also potentially what its downside might be.
I think that there's an odd discrepancy between the way humans are willing to accept a mistake from another human, but not from a machine. So in your case of the loan, you seem more disgruntled if it's a machine denying you your loan than just, the person on the other end of the phone. And similarly with the autonomous driving, with the few accidents that have happened in the autonomous side, for say from Tesla and Uber, there's been a huge outcry, yet, people are crashing their cars on a super regular basis in a way humans are, and we seem to accept that, yet we don't accept a computer system doing that, even if they're doing it at a lower rate, a provably lower rate than a human. So there's going to be some mindset shifts required for this stuff to really, I think, become super mainstream. Yeah.
Do you think that will happen as it just becomes more normalised, though?
I guess so. I think really hard. Yeah, I would guess so, but it's certainly a complex one.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's probably similar to the situation you mentioned earlier with the amount of data that we now accept that will go out there. If you'd said to somebody, say before the internet, can we please have all this data? Can you write down all these things about yourself? People would run a mile. But now, of course, it becomes second nature. So. Yeah,
absolutely. I mean, I think, say with the healthcare example, I'm very torn because, I think data privacy is a very, very important thing. Yeah, I can kind of, get the insights into potentials of what you could do if you did actually have access to all this information about people. And it's a difficult one.
But don't you think it depends on the society that the person lives in? Because, for example, in China, they use facial recognition to find people for jaywalking, and that's okay in that society, but it's obviously not okay here.
Yeah, I mean, I don't actually know what the public opinion of that stuff is like in China, actually. I'd be interested to find out. I guess that points at really a huge determining factor in this case is actually what governments decide to do. And it's going to be very interesting to see what governments, say in England or elsewhere, do decide to do.
Yeah, but because of that, I kind of also feel that because of the mind shift and the society accepting it more in China, that's why it could be said that they're leading in the AI stuff and data science field as well, just because people are more accepting towards it. Whereas in Western countries, it seems like people are more focusing on the ethical side of things. Mm-hmm. I'm not saying it's a bad thing that we're focusing on it, but as a point of interest, it seems like the ethics is holding the field back to a certain degree.
Yeah.
I'd take a different view on that, is that the people who work in the industry have to be, when you work in a democracy, you have to be very conscious that things like data should and can be democratically controlled. So you should design your software, your algorithms, everything else for the ability to people who have created the data or have something represented in that data that represents them to be taken away, because they may wish to do that for whatever reason, which may, on the one hand, slow us down a bit, but probably in the long term makes things more robust, because it kind of allows for every eventuality, and also kind of makes democracy a bit more up to date in terms of the ability to make decisions with quite complex things. And as engineers, we've always had democratic constraints on things we do. Building roads and bridges and other things, you often have to build them where people live or near where people live. So there's always an interaction in terms of what you might like to do to solve a problem for society and how that affects people who might be adversely affected by it. So, as in an engineering profession, you need to have to be conscious about you're doing things in the real world and you have to interact with real people.
I guess the tension is that because of these internet giants, they in a way became the holders of the keys, not the governments, because their rise was just so quick into all this stuff. So it's interesting seeing the governments, as GDPR is basically a, fight back against the Googles of the world. Yeah, it's interesting seeing that happen. I think probably is the right thing to do.
And I think one thing that obviously goes hand in hand with data collection and data privacy and all these concerns is the issue of data security and the possibility that all of this very sensitive data potentially could be hacked and could be misused by governments or individuals. What's the way forward for that, do you think?
I mean, it's a constant battle, isn't it? You're constantly trying to improve your security and say white or black hackers are constantly trying to break those systems, and I guess you just hope where your data isn't the place that got hacked, right? I think it's going to be an ongoing struggle between building secure systems and people trying to break them. Yeah.
For us, I guess the way we approached it's a bit counterintuitive, because on one hand we do want data to analyze, but on the other hand we don't want to store any of the data because that makes the compliance side of it so much easier. And we're a startup, and when we approach big companies and say, would you be interested in it? It makes it so much easier for us to say, we actually store only your name, surname, email, organization, and that's about it. Everything else we pull in real time, so we don't actually have access to your calendar data. And I feel, it's a weird approach because companies tend to store things to analyze it. But if you can train the model to make it good enough without storing data, that will be a huge plus for you, because you make yourself less vulnerable to attacks, but it's also a huge plus for the company, especially if you're working in the B2B sector.
And I think that's a really kind of ahead of the curve on that, because there's certainly lots of the big organizations are trying to develop algorithms that work exactly in this way, where the actual data that the model is seeing is in a way obfuscated or at least not stored, but they can still get the information gains from those. So.
And that's where the accessibility comes in, because of all the APIs, you're now able to do it, which you weren't able to do beforehand. And it's huge.
Yeah.
I chaired a fascinating debate when would it be, back in January. So I chair a resilience committee in the US. And it was fascinating because we had one of the state authorities in the US had been hacked, the State Transport Authority. And they still had to run the transport network. And to me, it was a really instructive lesson for modern business, that they'd forgot how to run their affairs without computers. You almost had to think to yourself, because computers were telling them so much about what they do, what their day job is, how they organise it. Even they struggled to pay people's wages or record their time without computer networks.
They were trying to still function, but without the use of computers.
Yes, they had to, because their computers didn't work. And it would be really instructive for most organisations to actually try and do that for a few days, because you then start to understand what's essential to your functions as employees, as an organisation, and what's not. and how much you're reliant on things. Because when it comes to hacking, you'd expect every organisation to get hacked at some point within its life. And if you're lucky, it won't be serious. But, the higher the profile of the organisation, probably the more serious it's going to become. So you've got to think, how do you organise when you've been hacked? How do you recover? And how do you mitigate the damage? And that, if you kind of go into it with that mindset and approach, you're probably going to come out with a reasonably good solution to it.
It's probably a good personal experiment to try and take 3 days without any computers whatsoever in your life. Yeah.
Breaking out into a cold sweat at the very thought. But I mean, it is. It's a good point, because I believe that is something that's starting to happen. I believe that a lot of governments and big businesses are starting to almost go back to using, snail mail or fax machines, or what stuff that would be seen as quite antiquated, because you can't hack a piece of paper. Obviously, you can hack a computer. So I think that's probably a similar thing, like things that we would think of as being out of date, but actually, if they're not part of this system, can actually be the more secure in this day and age.
And also within engineering, we do occasionally have to remind people who are new to the industry that folk did achieve a lot before computers. We could build very big buildings without using a computer. So it is possible to do these things, and it also helps you when you're going through and developing as an engineer to actually try and do things from first principles occasionally. Really is quite instructive, because it helps really get a better understanding of things rather than always relying on something else to come up with a result for you.
I mean, that still blows my mind, thinking about doing those early NASA launches, where people are checking stuff by hand, checking the mass by hand. That's absolutely incredible. So, yeah.
And has that been instructive on how you've kind of approached your own business and how you'd handle data since, like, looking at those kind of examples and those debates?
Well, it's when you're trying to organise the traffic in a city, you need a combination of people who've done it for a long time with some modern computer techniques to help and assist them. So if you can get the right balance between leaving the people in control who should be in control, but actually giving them more functions and tools, that is always the best way to do it. And there was a point you made earlier about, if you're bringing in AI, actually try and reskill some of your own staff, because the people who understand the problem in terms of having to deal with it previously, if they can get empowered to solve it and given more things to solve it, you actually keep them as employees, but also they then kind of grow and take the business forward. So it's that kind of mindset you have to get into.
So aside from this issue of security and data privacy, what other challenges have you come up against, and how have you kind of worked around them?
I guess for us, because we are still quite early stage and we play around with it a lot, we want to see what's going to happen if we do something silly. A lot of the things we saw was, yes, it works in the way we predicted, but then some of the things we saw was something we completely didn't anticipate, and that's a bit scary, because with AI, when a computer makes a decision on its own behalf, it's hard to know what the decision is going to be. The success rate, as you mentioned, could be 95%, but those 5%, when it goes wrong and you can't anticipate it, that's where the problem is, that's where the challenge is, and that could be a big thing for businesses who operate on a large scale. So I feel that's a big one.
I think as a data science practitioner, some of the biggest challenges with working with businesses is really building up the trust in what your algorithms are doing. So, often the thing you've built could be just a black box. You're putting in this information, it's saying, oh, take this action, and that could be a quite serious action for that business. It could be increase their prices, or bid higher on an auction or something, and they want to know why it's saying that. And really, this idea of model interpretability is a really big challenge, I think, for data science practitioners in terms of what they're doing. So not just simply saying this is the prediction, this is the output, but being able to explain why it's predicting that. And there's a lot of work being done in that now, and I think it's progressing well. So, but certainly that's a challenge for data science practitioners in terms of being able to communicate and explain exactly what their models are doing and why. And especially because you're doing this stuff at such a big scale, so doing that effectively is difficult.
And do you find that when you are like working with companies where maybe the people making the decisions know they want to implement AI in a certain way, but they don't necessarily know a lot about it on the granular scale, do you find you get a lot of people who don't understand what they're really asking for, or maybe think that you can do things that you can't do, or have expectation management, that kind of thing?
Absolutely. Expectation management would just be hitting the nail on the head. That's a big part of it. There's so much discussion around it, but really knowing what's possible or knowing what's not possible, or if it is possible, what's required to get there is, for me, in my job, a big challenge, definitely.
I think one big problem the AI industry has is what you'd call domain engagement, because computer science has traditionally been very separate from social science. So from the sciences that engage with society, it's very much been in its own box. It's been almost its own black box, using algorithms and talking in formulas and using software techniques and playing games and all sorts. Now it's being forced into the real world to engage with real world problems. One of the biggest challenges you have as a business is to find somebody or a group of people who can be that conduit and that translator between the computer science world and the real world domain that you're in, because often there's a lot of misinterpretation. So you might say and describe something one way in your particular profession or your particular domain, but it's completely misinterpreted in the computer science domain, and vice versa. And those misinterpretations and in some respects the lack of transparency and description of AI can often lead to rather large mistakes and disjunctions between the two. So that's probably for quite a while going to be the biggest problem, because until you get more social scientists and more people with broader social experience into computer science as it grows as a discipline, that translation's always going to be a real problem.
Yeah, would absolutely agree with all of that, and I think it goes both ways. I think computer science is really going to benefit from having a much more wider variety of input from other disciplines, and it's going to be a real two-way gain. And also, if you can manage to span both those places, if you can have some good specific domain expertise or some good business expertise and have some good technical skills, you can put yourself in a very valuable position for companies or just yourself.
Yeah, I mean, to add to that, I guess a lot of the things we discussed today, the big point that came out of the discussion was that AI works really well when it's in conjunction with the human being. And that's where the kind of social sciences, as you say, come in to not just assist the decision making, but also the social sciences saying, okay, how can we make the AI benefit our work? So it's a two-way street.
And looking across the whole industry, really, which companies stand out to you as companies that have used AI particularly well, large or small?
Well, obviously the internet giants, they were the ones who really started using this stuff in a hugely impactful way.
I suppose as the traffic control technique we have has probably its best applicability in China. We've had a lot of interaction with Chinese AI companies, and they've come up with some really good stuff, because their approach to it is, well, let's try stuff. Let's see what works, and then if it works, try some more of it. An example, at the AI summit I went to the week before last, there were some really trivial examples when you think, oh, okay, that probably is quite useful, is that people ordering a computer on a Friday night, and it arrives within 5 minutes, because the analytics has predicted people in that district of the city will be ordering computers at that time of night, so they're already shipped before they're ordered. Or even simple things like, going into a restaurant. One of them said he was quite surprised with the example. He goes into a KFC in Beijing and pays for it with his face. Because KFC know connected to his bank, and no facial recognition means it can access the bank account. So in some respects, there's lots of things that people would agonise over in terms of the ethics of that, but actually the ability to move away to a cashless economy to do trivial transactions without having to worry about security. So I always look at the examples from there and the way the internet giants in China have grown to see what potentially is possible. But then it's always good for the ethics discussion that we have is always really quite wide-ranged and interesting as well.
And I think this stuff is, it's going to happen kind of whether people like it or not. And I think it's more a case of how are we going to enable it to happen in the best and, safest, most ethical way, rather than just should we do this or not. People are going to be out there building stuff kind of whether governments like it or not. And we saw that with the, I forget the name, but the big fake news generator. And this from DeepMind, I'm not sure. And they basically didn't release the model. They released some of the examples of what it could do, and this is a system that can basically just output news articles. You can give it some information and say, I want a news article with this fact in it, and it'll spin up a whole spiel, just generated straight from the system. And that organization decided not to actually release the model publicly because they didn't want to be used to generate, really huge scale and very high quality fake news.
Was it OpenAI by any chance?
I think it probably was.
Yeah.
Getting confused with DeepMind.
Yeah.
Thank you.
That's right. Yeah.
So.
Although another example of that is that the AI technology we use, AI planners, is used in the media to come up with storylines within soap operas and to make sure they're consistent with the prior soap opera use.
As a professional copywriter, that chills me to the core.
Only the storyline, not the dialogue.
Oh, sure. Okay, good. That's all right.
only the storyline yet.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, who knows? Give it a couple of years.
Yeah.
But we've touched a couple of times now on this global aspect of AI and how the ethics is, but just in a practical sense as well. If you are working on a global, international scale, which I presume you are, what are some of the challenges around that in terms of obviously different countries, different governments have different approaches, different countries have different levels of technology, obviously, implemented across the board in their municipalities. How do you handle that kind of making sure you can offer your service, on a global scale, even though different countries are very different in terms of where they are with AI?
I think that's when you really do have to understand both the culture and the legal system in different domains. And you have to make sure that things like data management and where you store data and physically where you store data, because it's all right saying it's in the cloud, you have to know where that cloud is actually planted for a lot of these contracts and who can look at it. Management of access and things mean that really quite important stuff like how people move around cities. Most countries like to keep that to themselves within their own national territories for obvious reasons. But actually you can come up with techniques that can assist with that and improve that across boundaries. You just have to have the right kind of structures, both technically and organisationally, to deal with it. But you need to think about that when you start, not try and re-implement it as you get halfway through. Because it is a global market, both for people, for data, for techniques, but there are these national constraints and national ways of doing things that also you have to be conscious of if you're moving around.
I'll leave a nice creative question for last. I want you all to make a little prediction. Where do you think AI is going to be? Obviously, that's a very broad question, but give me one example of something you think is going to be around in AI in, say, 5 years, 10 years, that we're not seeing yet in the mainstream. What do you think one of the biggest changes is going to be?
Well, I won't use one of my own. There was that summit, there was one person who put a prediction for 2050, which his view was that it would be perfectly possible to download a person into a machine by 2050 and make the machine as such that it could continually be replaced. So it caused an issue for what are people and consciousness and the whole debates about AI. But he said technically, probably within the next 20 to 30 years, it may well be done. Whether you would want it to be is a completely different question, but that seems to be where the barriers to the science are going.
I think if we're making speculative science fiction-esque stuff, then I would say, that would how you'd see a walking, talking robot wouldn't be wouldn't be from someone just building it. It would be from just the closer and closer interconnectedness between humans and technology, to the point where it's so blurred you're not really sure if you're looking at a human or a computer, and these kind of like neural interfaces and human computer interfaces are all being worked on by Elon Musk and everybody, and I think that's going to be really interesting and exciting to see. Maybe my 5-year prediction is more like a hope and a prediction would be just a much more higher scale personalized healthcare. So you don't just go to your GP and chat to them. You maybe check in every month and put your hand in a sensor and they take a bit of blood and check if you're okay. That would be really cool to see. Yeah.
5 years, probably better accuracy. Most definitely going to happen because of the availability of models, availability of data. We can train them better. By 2050, AGI, artificial general intelligence, quite a high chance of that happening. So symbiosis, as you say, with humans, or a completely different computer system that is as smart as humans are. So, yeah.
Cool. Well, thanks, guys. That's been a really interesting discussion. If our listeners want to find out a little bit more about you guys and the work that you do, where can they find you?
Well, they can find us on our webpage, which is simplifaisystems.com. And I think more generally, look out for us in a few years' time managing the traffic in their cities.
Oh, excellent. And that's Simplifai AI, isn't it?
Simplifai AI.
Mm-hmm. Great.
For me, our website, meetwithfocus.com. People can also feel free to reach out on LinkedIn, and we're based at Nexus, which is literally up the road in Leeds. So happy to have people drop by.
Yeah, and similarly, you can get me on LinkedIn, DB Cerigo would be how to find me. And yeah, if you want to talk data science or you need some optimization work for your business done, then yeah, anytime.
And you can find out more about this podcast and Element 14 on the Element 14 community. We are the world's largest online community for engineers, makers and tech professionals. Please visit element14.com/community for more information. Thanks very much, guys, and we'll be back next month with another discussion. So, bye.
Thanks, bye.
Thank you.